Okay, thank you to everyone who came to join us in this second session of the day. It's our first session with talks that were submitted. And we have a great lineup of 4 speakers. So the way it's gonna break down is we have 25-minute slots for each speaker. So there'll be time for them to give their talk and then a few minutes for questions. But we'll also reserve some time at the end of the session after all the talks are over for any further questions that people have. So now what I want to do is introduce our first speaker who already has her slides up for us. And she will be Claire Bergey from University of Chicago. Take it away, Claire.
All right, thank you. So hi, I'm Claire. I'm a grad student at the University of Chicago. Today I'm going to talk about a project I'm co-leading with Ben Morris, who's another grad student at UChicago, and working with our advisor, Dan Murawski. And this is about how people remark on the atypical and the implications of this for language learning and language modeling. Okay, so broadly, a question we're interested in here is how do we learn about the typical features of things? So let's say you're a young kid learning many concepts for the first time. How do you come to learn that this is an apple, but a slightly atypical one given its yellow color? Well, one thing you can do is learn from direct observation. So you see a bunch of apples in your environment and accumulate experience with them over time. And then after a while, you would have a nice kind of distribution of apple colors. But of course, direct observation isn't the only information available. Language also offers a lot of information to a young learner. So having this additional information could be especially helpful for very young children with limited observational experience, or for rare categories or unobservable features. It's sort of like a shortcut to take advantage of someone else's hard-won experience. And we know that language enables learning about the world, even in the absence of direct visual experience, for instance. Nice distribution. For instance, blind children and adults acquire visual word meanings and property information that's fairly similar to the judgments of their sighted peers. And in a different vein, computational models that encode the statistics of language recover quite a bit of semantic information. So clearly, there's a lot of conceptual information that's contained in language. And here we want to ask specifically, how does language convey feature information about in its statistical regularities? So evidence from lab tests suggests that feature information is not distributed in language in the way it's distributed in the world. So when you see an object like this, you'll probably refer to it as an apple, not describing its features any further, precisely because it's typical that its color goes undescribed. But on the other hand, when you see this object, you're much more likely to spontaneously mention its color. So call it a yellow apple. And this likely derives from general principles of efficiency in communication. So we could also describe that previous apple as red, but it feels redundant given our world knowledge. So instead, we can only use description when it's necessary or relevant. And this pattern of language use pretty straightforwardly predicts that though we see lots of typical red apples in the world, we'll rarely hear them described as such. Whereas the more atypical apple features will more often be described. So feature information in language would not be structured the way it's sort of structured in the world. And crucially, the success of this kind of pattern of language rests on your interlocutor's world knowledge. So in all these cases, you can kind of skip out on talking about the red apple's color because the listener can kind of fill in the gaps. But what about when you're talking to someone with much less world knowledge, as a young child? So perhaps in that case, language is used quite differently. All right, so we know that child-directed speech is characterized by high levels of repetition and redundancy compared to typical adult speech. And further, parents calibrate some aspects of their speech to align with their children's knowledge. So perhaps child-directed speech conveys feature information very differently from typical adult speech. So one possibility here is that child-directed speech highlights the typical features of things, especially for young children. It's sort of over-descriptive. And then another possibility is that child-directed speech looks more like adult speech, where efficiency drives us to focus on notable or atypical features. All right, so as a general outline, first I'm going to talk about a corpus analysis of parent speech and ask the question, how do parents describe things to their children? So do they mostly mention typical or atypical features of things? And then does this change over development? And then second, I'm going to talk about language models, typicality judgments. And the reason we're doing this is sort of two-pronged. So first, we want to know what typicality information might be available to children in language that might go beyond the sort of direct co-occurrences of nouns and adjectives we talk about in the corpus analysis. But second, kind of more broadly, we're curious whether sort of more sophisticated language models might capture this kind of typicality information or not, sort of beyond the question of whether this specific information is available to kids. So for the corpus analysis, we looked at the Language Development Project, and this is a longitudinal corpus of parent-child communication in the home among families in the Chicago area. And we extracted all co-occurring nouns and adjectives in utterance of adult speech, so these are mostly parent speech, and then filtered to only include concrete adjective noun pairs. So this is to exclude pairs that would be pretty hard to judge the typicality of, like good job, for instance. And here are some examples of the utterances we pulled. So, don't put a plastic cup in there. I like your scaly skin. You can see there's kind of like a nice variety of description that people are providing here. And we pulled a little over 2,000 unique adjective noun pairs, and then we have usage sort of data for each of these pairs. So we gave each of these adjective noun pairs to raters on Amazon Mechanical Turk and asked them a question like, how common is it for an apple to be a yellow apple? And then they rated this on a scale from never to always. So here are those same utterances now ranked by the typicality of the adjective noun pair they contain. So you can see, people are capturing the typicality pretty nicely here. Chalky hands is pretty rare. Yellow bananas is pretty common. Okay, so here was our prediction that parents would predominantly mention atypical features, ones that are sometimes rarely or never true of the thing they describe, rather than mirroring the future information in the world in their speech. And here's what we found. So this is the distribution of adjective noun typicality in all parent speech in the corpus. Pretty overwhelmingly, parents are noting atypical features rather than typical ones. But this is over a pretty broad age range of kids from 14 months to about 5 years old. So how does that change over development? So now broken down by age, with the youngest kids at the bottom and the oldest kids at the top, we can see that this pattern holds across our age range. So even when speaking to their 14-month-olds, parents predominantly mention atypical features like brown apple and yellow apple, but red apple, not so much. And you might notice that it looks like the youngest kids are getting relatively more typical feature description. So that fat right tail at the bottom that kind of seems to thin out going up as kids get older. So what's going on in there in that range of highly typical features? Here's the proportion of highly typical features. So they're rated as often, almost always, or always true, plotted over development. So at around 14 months, these highly typical pairs make up about 20% of parents' description. And then by 34 months or so, they make up only about 8%, and that stays fairly constant through the rest of the age range. And this is consistent with the idea that parents adapt their speech to their child's knowledge, providing relatively more typical feature information to very young children who know less about the typical features of things, and increasingly shifting towards atypical description that assumes more world knowledge as their children grow older. All right, so overall, we found that children predominantly hear about the atypical rather than the typical features of concrete things. And this pattern is pretty consistent across age from 14 to 58 months. But within this broader pattern, there's a developmental shift. So the youngest children hear relatively more description of typical features, and this typical description drops off as children grow. So given this language environment, children can extract feature information from language in the same way they extract it from the world and get a realistic picture of what's typical. So we wanted to push this question a bit further. How might children extract typical feature information from language? All right, and to approach that question, we're going to ask a related question, which is whether language models extract typical feature information from language. So one possibility is that children use broader statistical regularities in language to learn about the typical features of things. And so far, we've examined direct co-occurrence of nouns and adjectives in sentences like, here's a yellow apple. But perhaps children can use other regularities in language to constrain their inferences. So some researchers have suggested that children and adults may use direct and then later indirect co-occurrence to structure their semantic knowledge. So we wanted to see if a model that uses indirect co-occurrence to infer word meaning could extract typicality information from child-directed speech. And one such model is word2vec. So we train word2vec on our parent-child interaction corpus, LDP. And then we also used a version of word2vec that was pre-trained on Wikipedia as a comparison. Given that LDP is small, we think that the LDP model will likely underestimate the structure and language available to kids. And the Wikipedia model will likely overestimate it. Okay, so briefly, word2vec is a model of distributional semantics that uses indirect co-occurrences between words to infer a semantic space. So words that occur in similar sentential contexts in a corpus will be represented as similar in this space. And ideally, that means that words with similar meanings are represented as similar by the model. And prior work has found that these models generally do capture some information that's also expressed in human semantic judgments. And so do our models in particular. So here I'm showing correlations between the model's similarity judgments and human similarity judgments of word pairs. And these are WordSim and SimLex, which are sets of word pairs within part of speech categories that are rated by humans for similarity or relatedness. So the Wikipedia trained model captures these judgments pretty decently. This is kind of about as good as it gets for word2vec. And our LDP trained model captures them more weakly, but still somewhat. So knowing that these models capture some information about human semantics in general, we next asked how well do they capture typicality information in particular? So that is, do they judge typical adjective noun pairs to be more similar than atypical ones? And to sort of simplify this problem for the model, we constrained our test set to nouns that occurred in our corpus with at least one high typicality adjective and one low typicality adjective. So for example, apple occurred with both red and brown, and our participants on mTurk judged red to be typical of apples and brown to be atypical of apples. And so we want to ask whether our word2vec models represent these nouns as more similar to their high typicality adjective than their low typicality adjective. So for instance, would the model represent apple as closer to red than to brown? And here are the similarity values from the LDP model. So here, each attached set of dots represents a noun, and the two adjectives, one low typicality and one high typicality, that it occurred with. So on the left would be, the similarity between brown and apple, and on the right would be similarity between red and apple. And then the blue line here is the average similarity of each group judged by the model, and the dotted line, the dashed line, is the human ratings scaled. Okay, so you can see that this model doesn't capture the typicality information very well. It's not differentiating systematically between high and low typicality pairs. But this could be a problem with our LDP model. It's trained on a really small corpus. So, let's look at Wikipedia to compare. So here's the Wikipedia trained word2vec model. And we can see that this model also doesn't capture this typicality information very well. There's a positive relationship here, but it's pretty weak. So here, typicality of description isn't a dimension of meaning that's well captured by these models. Okay, so word2vec wasn't able to extract reliable typicality information from child-directed speech or from Wikipedia, but going beyond this question of whether or sort of what typicality information is available to children, we were curious whether a much more sophisticated language model would perform better on this task. So, word2vec isn't the state of the art in language models. And so, our better language model is able to sort of capture this information. So here we looked at whether BERT would capture typicality in its evaluations of sentences. So BERT is trained to predict mass words in sentential contexts, and it allows words to be represented contextually within a sentence. So unlike word2vec, which encodes a kind of global context-free meaning for each word. And here I'd like to acknowledge Stefan Malin, who prompted us to look at BERT's performance on this task and sent us some of his code for evaluating sentences for BERT with BERT. Okay, so since BERT computes the probability of words slotting into sentences, we need some carrier phrases for our adjective noun pairs. And we use two carriers, one with a prenominal adjective position. So like I saw the adjective noun, I saw the yellow apple, and one with a predicate adjective. So the noun is adjective, the apple is yellow. And intuitively, the predicate form might tend to carry more typical feature information. So we wanted to test both of these constructions to kind of give the model a fair shot. All right, and here are the results for BERT in the same kind of format. So the prenominal sentence frame is on the left and the predicate sentence frame is on the right. And again, the scaled human ratings are the dashed line here, and the model average is the blue line. So BERT is differentiating more strongly between some pairs here, but overall does not very consistently rank high typicality pairs as more likely than low typicality pairs. And the number of pairs ranked correctly by BERT for each of these sentence frames is less than the number ranked correctly by Wikipedia trained word2vec. And the overall correlation among all adjective noun pairs is lower for BERT than for Wikipedia trained word2vec. So it doesn't seem like BERT is doing better than Wikipedia trained word2vec on this task. Okay, so to pull all that together, we found that children mostly hear about the atypical features of things. They hear about the green apple, the purple carrot, chalky hands, not so much about the red apple, the flat puzzle, or the wet petal. And parents are noting the notable features of things, which is completely intuitive to us as adults, but it relies on the kind of world knowledge that young children are still learning. And further, using more complex language statistics to constrain learning doesn't seem to resolve this problem. So we find that a distributional semantics level, model, word2vec, doesn't really capture typicality information very well. And a much more sophisticated model, BERT, doesn't do better than word2vec, suggesting that these associative learning mechanisms don't effectively capture typical feature information from language. So if feature information in the world looks something like this, we've shown here that even in child-directed speech, feature information in language looks like this. So children can't extract feature information from language in the same way they extract it from the world and get a kind of accurate picture of what's typical. So where does all that leave, a young learner when a child sees this object and here's it called a yellow apple? What do they infer? Well, one possibility is that they infer that many apples are yellow, and that would be kind of the simple associative thing to do. But as we've shown today, given children's language environment, it might be very misleading. And that would lead children to have skewed feature representations, and it's a possibility we're interested in exploring in the lab. Another possibility is that children mostly ignore language when learning about the features of things, and this is entirely plausible, but it poses a bit of a problem for rare or unobserved categories. And it also raises questions about the inferences children make when they don't have direct access to certain features. For instance, blind children who don't have direct access to visual features. And a final possibility is that children make the correct inference here. When they hear yellow apple, they infer that few apples are yellow. And how would they do this? There are several ways. They might use non-linguistic cues, syntactic cues, or they could use broader pragmatic abilities that allow them to infer that a noted feature is notable. So we're working now to test some of these possibilities in the lab. All right, and then also, how might language models, on the other hand, learn typical feature information? What I presented today, I think, suggests that associative mechanisms might not cut it to learn typical feature information from language. And it's worth noting here that in some ways, BERT is doing exactly what it's meant to do. It's saying that what the most likely utterance is, right? But to the extent that semantic relatedness is represented as the same thing as the likelihood of producing words together, these models will fail to capture world knowledge. So these language models lack pragmatic reasoning, and that's what allows humans to infer that a remarked upon feature is remarkable. Humans assume that people say things for a reason, that they're generally informative. And so integrating these kinds of principles of informativity might be necessary to allow language models to learn reliable world knowledge from text. All right, thank you to our lab, to our funders, and to Susan Goldmeadow and the LDP team. And that's us. Please get in touch to chat more about the project. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Claire. We have a few minutes for questions, so go ahead and indicate in the chat window if you have a question for Claire.
Shall I stop sharing, Subi? Or would you like me to keep?
We can leave it up for a second in case someone has a question about something. It would be useful, yeah. I see we have one question from Ellen.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was just wondering about your last interpretation. Like you mentioned, it makes sense that part of this is missing pragmatic reasoning. And I wasn't quite clear on how much you think it's also just missing these other modalities, like not having visual scene perception.
Yeah. So I think so certainly these kinds of models could learn better if they integrated something like machine vision or something and use like visual information to learn about feature distributions. And I think that would solve the problem for some sets of features that are really available, and it might not solve the problem for other sets of features, or perhaps other just general language inferences that require pragmatics. So I think that would kind of like solve most of the problem like we know about maybe, but not kind of the deeper problem here. So yeah.
We have another question from Gary.
Very cool work. It looked like the models, at least BERT, maybe Word2Vec as well, did show typicality effects for some noun adjective pairs. Did you notice what was different about them, or was it just an idiosyncratic set? Can you say something about what?
Yeah, I can't say that we've looked too deeply about like at which ones it gets right and which ones it gets wrong. And looking just at a subset of the data, we haven't seen any obvious patterns there. But it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the other kind of issue here is that this is constrained to features that actually get mentioned. So in many cases, the typical features aren't even the kind of most typical features, if that makes sense. They're only like the kinds of ones that get mentioned. Like no one talks about, a flat wall or something like that. And so I think to interrogate more deeply, like what kinds of features might be picked up on, we would want kind of a broader set to think about, even the things that people don't mention, whether these models capture those. But yeah, I would say we don't yet have anything to say about the ones that it gets right versus wrong.
Yeah, my hunch is that, something like red and yellow for apple, the colors are not diagnostic of apples. There are, even with other fruit, there's lots of fruit that's red and yellow. Whereas for something like striped and zebra, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of natural contrast to zebra, at least for American kids, might be horse, right? And what makes a zebra saliently different from a horse is that it's striped. And so that's both a typical feature and a diagnostic one when you consider the likely contrast category.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I think that people will be more likely to mention some of these like highly diagnostic features that that are where you kind of have like a minimal pair of types of objects, and you can just distinguish some category like a striped sort of zebra. I think that's a nice point. And I mean, even then, like kids aren't getting that much input of the like striped zebra type. But I would think that perhaps kids and the model would learn those kinds of pairs that get mentioned maybe a bit better than all these other things that don't. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to take the privilege as chair to ask a question that I have. But before I ask, Claire, can you stop your screen share so that Balance can put his slides up?
Yeah.
So my question, Claire, is you have these three options that you talk about near the end. So, maybe kids just aren't using language to learn about typicality. Maybe they are, maybe it's something like syntax, pragmatics, or even non-linguistic cues. And you said that's what you're turning to work on now. I was wondering if you would speak a little bit about what those things you're looking at.
So Well, I should mention that there's some really nice work by Ali Horowitz and Mike Frank looking at whether kids like 3 and 4-year-olds can infer about novel objects, like when a feature is mentioned, that feature might be atypical. And they find that it does, they need a lot of scaffolding, but around 4 years old, they're able to make this kind of inference. So I think that kind of pragmatic inference probably, on the late end of our age range is something that those kids could do. And in terms of the syntactic cues, so we really thought that there would be a strong correspondence between the sort of syntactic frame and typicality here. And we went looking, it's still a preliminary analysis, but we didn't find a really strong relationship between those two things. And I think we'd want to find that in the corpus before we go kind of asking kids with these different sentence frames and seeing what they learn. And the non-linguistic cues, I think, are a tough one. We have video for this corpus, so we're able to look at whether people, point out an atypical feature and laugh about it, or they, there's some prosodic thing going on. We're interested in looking at it, but it's sort of a longer range thing. And then sort of more proximally, we're looking to run some tasks in the lab, just asking kids about various stimuli and seeing if they choose to mention these atypical features more than typical ones, to see whether they have maybe this intuition there a little bit earlier than they're able to make the inference and comprehension. So that's the task we're looking at right now.
Interesting, really cool. Thank you so much, Claire. Now we'll turn things over to our next speaker in the session. So I'll introduce to you Balint Forgács, who is from ELTE.
Hi, and thank you very much. I'm really glad to present here and give a talk at DUCOG, which is a conference I really like and try to visit every time. But despite the fact that we are not in Dubrovnik, it's really nice to be among you. So I'm going to talk to you about a set of experiments which has been investigating how mentalization and semantic processing are related. So the basic assumptions here is that social cognition and language is fundamentally connected. However, there are multiple possible connections here. Fitch, for example, has been emphasizing that more general social cognitive abilities aid communicative systems, even in the animal kingdom. But there's something specific about human communication, which is that it has an inferential touch. So unlike earlier conceptions of communication, that it is a transmission of information, a veridical and airtight transmission of content, newer pragmatic accounts suggest that we actually infer meaning as intended by social partners. So actually something is happening in our minds, and it's not happening in our ears. So under this conception, theory of mind should play a critical role, an essential role to inform the intentions, beliefs, and desires of others and connect that with semantics they intend to convey. To put forward the main claim that I will try to argue for is that language is based on two very fundamental aspects. One is what is said, or the explicatures, which is all the linguistics mechanisms and infrastructure we had in our brains, our minds. And also there's another side to it, the intended meaning, or the implicatures, which is very strongly dependent upon mentalization. So the main argument is that semantic processing is not simply sensitive to the social in general or social cognition, but specifically to theory of mind, and that the semantic systems of the brain are part of the mentalization systems. So this is coming from the of the social nature of meaning construction, but I'm going to show some evidence coming from neuroimaging, we're showing that mentalization and semantic processing systems are quite overlapping in the brain, and that there are social influences, actually mentalistic influences, on online semantic processing, and specifically the N400 event-related potential. So we took two approaches here. We conceptualized mentalization as induced by false beliefs, which has been suggested to be the litmus test of mentalization or theory of mind. So is semantic processing sensitive to false beliefs specifically? And we used our infant paradigm of the so-called Social N400 effect. And another approach was that we conceptualize mentalization as the mere presence of another person. So this assumes that there's a spontaneous attribution of mental states to our social partners. And so we were wondering whether the mere presence of another person could influence language processing or semantic processing. So what is this Social N400 effect? This is an effect that has been evoked by the classical N400 paradigm, extended to make it a sort of joint comprehension task. So the typical classical N400 is evoked by sentences ending on incongruent words. But these, such as the boy had gills, but these incongruent sentences could be rendered congruent by some additional information, such as in the boy's dream, he could breathe underwater. So this creates a context where the gills are not that incongruent as without the context sentence. So in this particular paradigm, what Ruschmeyer and colleagues did was to play these additional context sentences on headphones only to their participants, but had them read the target sentences on a screen together with the confederate and follow. They were explicitly required to follow the comprehension of this other person who did not have the additional information and should have understood the sentences as incongruent or weird. Now, what they found was an enhanced N400 response, even when the participant had sufficient contextual information, but the other person did not. So this N400 effect is thought to indicate semantic memory retrieval, and participants' brains acted as if they did not have sufficient information. So this was a curious effect, but this is more like a social effect that may or may not involve actual mental state attribution. The manipulation here is information asymmetry. One party has more information than the other. Now, it has also been shown that this is relatively insensitive to instructions. So attention of the participant need not to be directly linked to or directed towards the comprehension of the other person. It also should be noted that the Social N400 effect is usually smaller. Here you can see smaller in magnitude than the typical N400. The typical N400 is the red line, and the Social N400 is the blue line on these ERP plots of individual electrodes. Now, we sort of sought to look for a conceptual replication, but extended it. Instead of creating an information asymmetry, we created a false belief in an observer who was facing the participant, so not reading together, but sort of getting in a semi-interaction situation where we labeled the object correctly or incorrectly, but sometimes the objects, because of an object change, were labeled correctly only for the participants, and the label was incorrect for the observer. This is how it looked like. So the first object appears, observer notices, it's replaced. Now the second object is also revealed, so there's no incongruity. Canard, it was conducted in French. This is from our infant study. No false beliefs involved. Now here's a nursing bottle. Observer notices it. It is replaced by a spoon. but it was not revealed. So at the time of labeling, cuillère or spoon was incongruent with the falsely held belief that it's still a nursing bottle of the observer. So this was our critical condition. And here's what we found. So if we asked our participants to closely track whether the label made sense for the observer, they showed this N400 effect. It was half in magnitude as a typical N400. This showed that it's not merely an information asymmetry, but actually mentalistic belief attribution that can evoke this effect. So it's indeed a mentalistic effect. This is the distribution. The typical N400 is darker blue because it's a stronger effect. This is a subtraction figure. Viewing the head from above, nose is to the top of the page. And on the left side, you can see the social N400 effect, which is in the same time window and slightly weaker. Now, we were also curious whether we can induce this effect in a kind of passive listening, because our infants produced a social N400 effect without instructions. Of course, we were unable to provide such instructions for 14-month-olds. But curious enough, adults did not show a social N400 effect here, which is in line with prior adult studies using passive listening. But it is quite surprising, as if infants were more prone to mentalize and actually more skillful in tracking the language comprehension of another person. Now we did another replication where we slightly directed the attention of our participants towards the attention of the observer. So they needed to count, our participants needed to count how many times a particular object appeared for the observer. So they needed to take into account whether the occluder was lowered or not. But in this arrangement, we could not find a social N400 effect either. So taken together, it seems that false belief-based mentalization does evoke the social N400. So it's not a generic social cognitive effect. It's not driven by information asymmetry, but it is specifically belief attribution, attributing a mental content, an object representation for the other person, and then using that as an information springboard to generate an effect that has been previously believed to be specific to individual semantic processing, the N400. Now, previous studies all used a kind of contrast between the social, for the social N400 as an observer being present or not being present. So what if the social N400 effect is somehow the effect of a social presence during semantic processing? So this is where our second approach is coming from. We conceptualized mentalization as spontaneous attribution of beliefs. This is not false or beliefs. These are not false beliefs, but still assuming that belief attribution is constantly ongoing in the presence of other individuals. And we labeled objects correctly or incorrectly, either a person being present or absent, either in a live session, in a blogged design, or in a video session, also a blogged design. So this establishes really a minimal set of conditions or core conceptual assumptions for a communicative situation, even though our participants were not communicating. There's another person who understands language, and there's some semantic processing which both parties need to engage in. And what we found were two main effects. First, an incongruity effect, as we expect for a typical N400 paradigm, but we also find a main effect of social presence. So whether objects were labeled correctly or incorrectly, there was an additional enhancement of this N400 effect on the expected regions and in the expected time window of the N400. So this is breaking it down 4 by 4. On the lower row, you can see the incongruity effect, and the upper row, you can see the social presence effect. It seems to be slightly skewed to the left instead of slightly being skewed to the right, which is typical for the N400. But this is, we use the same exact predefined regions of interest where we would expect an N400 response. Now, to make sure that we did not make a fluke, we pre-registered a study, the same study, and using a video presentation, we were able to replicate it again. So again, 2 main effects: no interaction, an incongruity effect as expected, and a social presence effect, an enhanced negativity in the N400 time window. And again, here you can see the topo plots. So here this slight left skew is not so apparent. The effect is slightly smaller, but these are absolutely significant and present effects. So almost all psycholinguistic experiments have been based on testing individuals individually, reading tasks or auditory presentations of stimuli. And so this is how the semantic memory system and the psycholinguistics and the neural mechanics of language comprehension have been investigated. So this could have been a somewhat artificial situation in the sense that prior to the invention of writing systems, all semantic processing occurred in social interactions. So it does seem to be the case that inferring meaning as it is intended is a critical thing, might be a critical thing for the semantic system. And so the question arises, what is the direction? So are semantic memory systems modulated by mentalization, which is a kind of more general social effects that have been argued for and presented before? Yes, the N400 is sensitive to various social effects, but our results raise the possibility that whether the direction is going in the other way. So mentalistic systems are modulated by semantic memory processing. And so this is more like a curious collection at this point. Of course, experiments need to be carried out in this respect. But if one takes a look at the meta-analysis of the theory of mind network, and specifically of false belief attribution, but even the cognitive cluster, as Schurz and colleagues have labeled, the cognitive aspect of mind reading, or cognitive tasks of mind reading, they all seem to involve the bilateral temporoparietal junction, of which Wernicke's area is part of. They also seem to include anterior parts of the temporal lobe. These are the top left 2 figures. Now, the generators, neural generators of the N400 effect have been identified as starting from the Wernicke's area near or at the temporoparietal junction and spreading forward on the temporal lobe towards its more anterior areas. Lau et al. Also suggests that the posterior middle temporal gyrus, the area in the vicinity and in overlap, perhaps, is responsible for generating the N400 response. So in sum, I would like to propose that beyond these various social cognitive effects on language, our results could be taken as evidence for a specific deep connection between semantic processing, as indicated by the N400, so a functional correlate of semantic comprehension, and belief attribution, but not generic TOM, not generic mind reading, but specifically the part of mind reading which considers conceptual beliefs. So not the attribution of desires, of emotions, or the attribution of attention, and it's not a generic cognitive effect. The other way around, all the social effects reported before could be due to actually ongoing mind reading effort by the participants when the social nature of or social influences of the N400 have been reported before. And so I would like to argue that our results and these effects we report here raise the possibility that the semantic system is constitutive part of the theory of mind system. So the locations overlap, the functional measures seem to match, and if communication is inferential in nature, mind reading could have preceded and served as a source of semantic content-based transmission and inference of meaning as intended. So in short, it is, I would argue, semantics that is anchored in intentions and not the other way around. So thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank my co-authors, my colleagues, the lab, all the participants in these studies, and our funders, and I would be very happy to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Balint. We have a few minutes for questions. We'll take the first one from Ellen.
Predictably, I do have a question on the N400 talk. Thank you so much. It's really fascinating. I'm really glad to be reminded of the older social N400 effects, and these newer ones are really interesting. I'm sort of myself exploring like a different account of the N400, and I'm kind of curious whether you think that it could cover these results. The way I'm starting to think about it more is as showing the activity of the conceptual network and other areas as we're finding new episodic memories. So we're constantly, constantly through life, continuously, we're updating our episodic memory of what's just happened, right? In a way that will last beyond the current moment. And I'm kind of wondering if like the main effects you're seeing of the social context are like that. When I'm just getting a disembodied sentence, an experiment that's like describing some, unknown entities, and I'm binding that into episodic memory in a situation where someone else also has different beliefs about the situation, it seems like we can imagine that there's sort of more content that I need to encode about that current moment in the episode, that it's not just the facts of the situation, but now I'm having to code, as you say, maybe some representations of the other actors that are encoded in the theory of mind network. So there's just like more regions maybe, but also just more information that needs to be updated in episodic memory when I get this critical word. So it's very speculative and just thinking it through as I was watching your talk. But I mean, would that be kind of consistent? I think it's consistent with your message that all these things are kind of part of the same network for updating our beliefs, that there's not like a semantic separate from a social system or something like that.
Well, thank you. I guess I would need to learn a lot more about the details of your study, because it sounds really fascinating, but it's not very easy now to imagine for me what is actually going on. But in general, it is. I have a quite conservative take on the N400 that is more indicative of semantic memory, and specifically semantic memory retrieval, and not contextual integration or these other accounts. Brouwer had I believe, a very convincing meta-analysis on this, and Tom Urbach from the Kutash lab has just recently published in PNAS a study which reinforces this idea that there's this semantic retrieval, prediction and retrieval going on, and there's a predictive element in the N400. So in the case of episodic, I'm just not sure how that meshes up with the predictions or the actual conceptual knowledge, but it certainly would include in my understanding of this predictions that are semantic in nature, which are derived from the episodic situation, but attributed for the other person. So there would be a translation, I would assume, of all the information to the semantic system, but it is as a mentalistic system, it is utilizing it for understanding more things than just language.
We also have a question from Marina.
Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I'm really kind of empathetic with the points that you're making. In fact, I would go further than that. I'm not sure why you're leaving reading out of the game. You know, I feel like when I read books, I think a lot about the author's intent. So I'm not sure it's not social in the way that you think. But I actually wanted to talk to you about the brain parts of what you were saying, and kind of it's like a levels of analysis kind of question. So I think there's some quite convincing evidence that actually theory of mind and language don't exactly overlap, even though if you look at ERP data or even MEG data, they might a little bit look like they do. That includes patient evidence, people who have aphasia but no theory of mind evidence deficits, and vice versa, but also kind of pretty fine-grained fMRI studies. But I'm just not sure even why that would be important to your argument. Like, suppose that every time we're trying to understand language, we're in some ways engaging in a pragmatic / social reasoning kind of task. Why do you need it to be the case that those two systems share neural machinery? Why is that important to your argument?
Well, it's a proposal. Maybe these data can be accounted for in another manner, but currently I do not have any other strong explanations. So a generic social effect, of course, systems can be dissociated, and then we typically assume that they are separate. So I'm not saying that the semantic system is not able to function without, but these are border cases, I would assume, and I would like to argue that actually, in order to be able to have a sense of meaning, it is so intimately intertwined with the social world that it is always intended. And I would in some way or another, and that's why I would unintended meaning. And so I absolutely agree that we wonder even about the intentions of the author or the intentions of the experimenter, actually, as participants. But it is a very different situation when we are in an online exchange, when we have perhaps a full model of another interacting person, and then I find it a weaker argument that somehow there's some kind of social cognition, some kind of empathic conceptualization of the social context, and I find it a more specific and targeted hypothesis that this is actually mentalistic in nature. So mental representations as attributed are just as important and influential and part of semantics.
So yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm just, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
we're a bit over.
We're done. Okay.
I'll ask you to stick around for the discussion period at the end, Marina, and maybe you can ask your question then. So for now, let's turn to our next speaker, Barbu Revencu from Central European University. You can go ahead and share your slides and get started.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Hi, everybody. I'm Barbu. I'm a PhD student at Central European University. And today I'm going to present you theoretical work on the cognitive architecture that allows us humans to interpret external symbols in communication. My goal today is to convince you of several related ideas regarding this architecture, which allows us to interpret stand-for relations between an external object and the referent. First, that stand-for relations are defined by the link between an object symbol and an entity under discussion, and not by the link between a symbol and an object in the world. Second, I will argue that we need two representational layers to model this relation. One for objects, which I will model on Pilishin's visual indexing theory, and one for entities under discussion, for which I will use discourse representation theory. In order to establish the links between the two layers, I will introduce an assignment function which connects them. Third, I will illustrate several depictive media to show that the system allows us to tackle a host of phenomena that may seem disparate at first glance, among which puppet shows, movies, and scientific graphs. And finally, I will use the available evidence on early pretend play to argue that the system develops early and reliably in human development. I would like to start this conversation by highlighting that there are two notions of reference which can be thought of as orthogonal to each other. On the one hand, world reference is a relation that figures prominently in causal informational theories of representation and which holds between representational tokens and objects in the world. On the other, discourse reference is an internal relation between representational tokens and objects in the universe of discourse. For our purposes, we'll take the universe of discourse to consist of the entities that are currently under discussion. Now, many external symbols fail to exhibit word reference. Consider this drawing of a dog, for instance, which I'm sure you'd all recognize as such. It does not pick out any particular dog in the world. It does not make any word state more likely, yet still it is a felicitous representation of a dog. In other words, this pixel constellation here on the slide stands for a non-specific dog token. And our question today is how do we interpret these object symbols? Here is my suggestion for how the cognitive architecture for interpreting stand-for relations might look like. We know from the object cognition literature that humans are able to parse visual scenes into distinct objects via an indexing system that provides pointers to these objects. This allows us to individuate objects and to track them through time and space. While visual features can be bound to object indexes, in other words, how the object looks like is encoded, the object indexing system is limited in providing conceptual information about the objects that it represents. And while the class of things which the indexing system is primarily attuned to consists of spell key objects, roughly physical objects which preserve cohesion in motion, it can be triggered by other types of input as well, such as marks on paper and pixel constellations. Indeed, most, if not all, adult experiments, such as the motion object tracking paradigm that you see on this slide, use virtual objects as stimuli. In sum, the input to the object indexing layer is a retinal stimulation caused by a visual scene, and its output is a layer of representation which represents the individuated objects in the scene. One caveat before moving on, I have modeled the object indexing system on Pilishin's visual indexes for expository purposes, but note that the system for object individuation that enters into the interpretation of stand-for relations, our topic today, may be distinct from the indexing that occurs in early vision. Now, beyond the ability to individuate objects, humans are also able to individuate entities under discussion in a conversation or discourse, for discourse internal co-reference and accumulation of information as the discourse unfolds. Take this example, for instance, in the mini discourse, John met a dragon, he slayed it mercilessly. Once John and the dragon are individuated as discourse reference, we can refer to them metaphorically with pronouns and update the information about them accordingly. Unlike the object indexing system, which is triggered by the immediate environment, there are no existence in the world restrictions for discourse reference, as any joke, novel, and thought experiment attest. In sum, the discourse referent layer, as conceived of in formal semantics, takes as its input noun phrases in a discourse or communicative situation and outputs a layer of representation D of individuated entities under discussion. To get to stand for relations between non-linguistic objects and discourse reference, we need a linking function which connects the two representational levels I have just introduced by providing a pointer from a visual index to a discourse referent whenever the object indexing system is recruited for interpretation. If instead of describing John's encounter with a dragon via language, we want to depict it, we can use visual objects to do so. Here, the stick figure, a visual object, would stand for John, a discourse referent, and the remaining drawing, a second visual object, would stand for a dragon, the second discourse referent. Thus, the input to the assignment function is a representation of an object that is used during communication as a symbol for something else. And what the assignment function does is create a local discourse-bound relation from one layer to the other by providing a pointer from the object representation to a discourse referent, such that the external object O stands for the entity under discussion, E. In order to make all this machinery work, we need one last component to account for the content of non-referring mental objects. Clearly, neither the noun phrase a red dragon nor the red drawing on the right in this story example refer to anything, so they could not have been caused by an object in the world. We therefore need a function that can fill such non-referring mental objects with content. And note that this requirement goes well beyond fictional kinds such as dragons. If, for instance, I were to ask you to imagine a fair coin tossed 10 times, the representational token you would use to keep track of this coin for this episode would not pick out any coin out there in the world. Rather, you would use your coin concept to generate a new instance for this occasion. For this purpose, we introduce a labeling function, which is a mental process that generates descriptions from the conceptual system, which can attach to mental tokens, in particular to discourse reference. Given a coin concept, we can use this function to label tokens at our own discretion. So the input to the labeling function is thus a concept C, part of the conceptual system, and its output is a description that can attach to discourse reference. To summarize the last couple of slides, in case I went too fast, the architecture I have put forth consists of two representational layers: the object layer, which individuates objects, the discourse referent layer, which individuates entities under discussion in a discourse, and two functions: assignment, which links the object layer to the discourse referent layer, and labeling, which generates descriptions from the conceptual system, which can attach to discourse reference. To illustrate the full model, consider this short Heider and Zimmer-like movie, which human adults spontaneously describe in terms of a chasing scene, including agents with beliefs and desires, and a house in which the small agents try to escape, even though adults know that these are not agents and that this square is not a house. Under this account, hypothetical human observer would solve this interpretive task as follows. The triangle in the scene causes a representation of an object which points back to the triangle, and the same in the case of the square. This is taken care of by the object indexing system. The object representations, in turn, point further to the discourse referent layer, which individuates the entities under discussion. In this example, an agent and a house. And since the agent and the house do not pick out any individuals in the world, the observer needs to recruit her conceptual system to generate two descriptions, one for a house and one for an agent, which are attached to the discourse reference. Together, they define two stand-for relations, one holding between object 1 and the fictional agent, the other holding between object 2 and the fictional house. The architecture that I have sketched is at work in many communicative devices which require stand-for relations between an object and the discourse referent during interpretation. And once these links are in place, communicators can manipulate the external objects to depict events, relations, and properties of the entities under discussion. Take, for instance, a piece of narrative fiction such as Snow White. Now, this story would require the audience to set up multiple discourse reference to keep track of who does what to whom in the story. It now becomes easy to see that there is a variety of ways in which external symbols can be added to supplement or replace the linguistic narrative. If actors play characters and props stand for objects, we get theater and live action movies. If puppets are operated from behind the stage, we get puppet shows. And if static drawings are displayed in temporal or spatial succession, we get animations and comic books, respectively. In all of these cases, mind external entities, like actors, puppets, animated figures, are temporary stand-ins for the fictional characters which the story is about. And beyond fiction, similar representational devices can be used to depict real-world rules and procedures. In this diagram, the European football offside rule is depicted by the position of colored circles, which stand for non-specific football players. Scientific graphs work much the same way. In this case, it's the legend that gives the mapping from the objects to the discourse reference, and space is used to convey magnitude. And finally, internet memes also exploit the same structure. This one on the slide depicts a relation between young people and the ideologies via a cliched relationship dynamic. Now, while the conventions for all of these categories needs to be learned in order to become a proficient interpreter, the basic structure underlying this variety might not be. So let me now turn to evidence that these relations become available early and reliably in development. So first, the infant object cognition literature reveals that infants can individuate and track objects spatiotemporally by their first year of life. Second, while the infant literature is mostly silent on discourse reference, the basic mechanism might be available to young infants for communicative acts broadly construed, such as pointing, for instance. And third, while the assignment and labeling functions have not been directly probed in infants, the available literature on early pretend play offers plenty of insight into the links between visual object symbols and discourse reference. And since object substitution pretense requires these links precisely, early competence in this domain implies early emergence of this general capacity. Typically, a pretend play setup involves toys and neutral objects and an adult experimenter who stipulates pretend identities or properties on the props. In this case, that the orange block is a carrot that the orange block stands for a carrot, whereas the yellow block stands for a banana. Then the experimenter gives children some information about these objects and prompts the children to act on the objects or manipulates them herself according to simple scenarios. By the second year of life, children choose the correct prop for different pretense actions. For instance, if they are told that horses like carrots and gorillas like bananas, they will choose the correct prop for different pretend eating actions. 2-year-olds can also follow simple causal transformations and refrain, for instance, from using this banana block if the gorilla ate it already, even though the block is still physically present. And 2-year-olds can also select pictures representing the imaginary transformations just enacted. In one study, the experimenter pretended that the gorilla spilled red paint over the horse. At test, children were shown these two photographs and were asked to show to the experimenter how the horse now looks like. They pointed to the one on the left, despite the perceptual similarity between the one on the right and the toy horse in front of them. In other words, 2-year-olds are able to answer questions based on what is being communicated about discourse reference, not about the physical symbols in front of them. Of course, it's possible that children believe that the relation between the object and the discourse referent is one of identity. The orange block is a carrot, the yellow block is a banana. However, this does not seem to be the case, as they keep make-believe identities distinct across contexts and speakers. So they are absolutely fine with treating the orange block as a bar of soap in a different pretend game, which shows that these relations are indeed local and discourse bound. Before I end, let me make a note on quarantining and pretend play. Until recently, there has been a large emphasis on the need to quarantine pretense representations. Originally, Alan Leslie introduced quarantining as a way of defending the integrity of the conceptual system. So if I may revisit this time-worn example one more time, suppose the child sees their parent pretend that the banana is a phone. Leslie wanted a way that can ensure that children do not come to believe that this banana is a phone or that bananas are phones after a pretense game. In later accounts by other researchers, however, quarantining was extended to cover the entire pretense episode. The idea being that pretense representations have to be stored away from the representations about reality so as not to corrupt them. But there are two relations involved in pretend play. One of them is a relation between objects and discourse reference. And under this account, quarantine in Leslie's original sense might not be needed at all. The child only needs to index a perceptually available object, which happens to be a banana, and to link it to the phone discourse referent. In addition, the relation that obtains between this object and the phone is a stand-for relation, not an identity one. So the content banana is phone is never represented. And last but not least, the relation is local, so it will be discarded at the end of the current pretend play episode anyway. The second relation in this structure holds between discourse reference and the world. Does this phone, which the banana currently stands for, exist in the world? Probably not. So this phone token does not pick out any phone in the world. However, phones do exist in the world, so children might waste good learning opportunities if they simply quarantine everything indiscriminately. So if pretense is a form of communication, quarantining the information predicated about the discourse reference by means of the props is precisely what we should not observe. Just as language can be used to talk about anything, props can be used to depict specific events, generic states of affairs, fictional content, and so on. But this is orthogonal to the problem of setting up the relation between a visual object and the discourse referent. In other words, we should not confuse the structure of pretense with the ontological status of what we talk about. If this is on the right track, pretend play, like any other form of communication, should lead to learning, and indeed it does. Preschoolers learn facts about novel kinds, such as their food preferences, from depiction with puppets. Similarly, they update their models of familiar kinds via pretense. If two dog props are depicted to be afraid of raccoons, children tend to generalize to the kind, compared to a specific language condition where the fear of raccoons is predicated about two specific dogs. And finally, in this very clever experiment, children were asked to pretend that a screwdriver is a sprock. They were then shown via this screwdriver that sprocks are used to push balls out of tubes. At test, they were asked by a different experimenter to hand out the sprock from this array, and compared to a non-pretense control condition, children thought that this object on the right is the most likely candidate for being a sprock because it's the only one which they didn't know the function of, and the only one which would be suitable for pushing balls out of tubes. This is what they learned during familiarization, but via the screwdriver. This suggests that children can learn the function of unknown objects as well as their shape from pretense using known objects as props. To conclude, to represent stand-for relations in communication, humans employ two representation layers, one for object indexing, the other for discourse referent individuation, and an assignment operation which maps from one layer to the other. These relations are ubiquitous across many communicative devices where the object indexing system of the interlocutor is recruited for interpretation. And finally, the ability to grasp these relations emerges early in human development, as shown by children's early proficiency with object substitution pretense, which involves props that are used and manipulated in order to convey information about discourse reference, and from which children can learn new information about the world, just like adults. Before ending, allow me to thank Gabor Brody for countless conversations on this topic over the past few years, and Gerga Chibra for inspiring this project, and CEU and the European Research Council for funding these chimeras, and you for listening.
Thank you, Barbu. We have some time for questions, so go ahead and signal yourself in the chat.
Can I stop sharing?
Yes,
because I don't see anybody.
May I ask a question?
Oh yeah, we have a question from Craig. Sorry, I didn't see you at first.
Yeah, that's fine. So thank you for a very interesting talk. I think it will help share some themes with other things that we'll be hearing. one question about the sort of straight, I mean, I think that you did a very lovely job of motivating the kind of various non-straightforward ways in which we make mappings between expressions in the real world. So, you know, they really aren't about identity, they're about stand for. There's these kind of local, sort of in the moment ways in which we refer to things that are depictions of things or pretense and things like this. I just wanted to talk, get your thoughts a little bit on the kind of more internal mapping issues that strike me as also being non-straightforward in ways that maybe we don't really recognize that often in psycholinguistics. So we have things like, you know, most of the students didn't come to the online lecture. They preferred to blah, 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 where they now refers to the complement set of, right? So they instead preferred to, so you're talking about the people who didn't come to the online lecture. And so you've kind of, the indexing that you've made between the pronoun, it's sort of being inferred in the moment, or things like, did you hear John got a capybara as a pet? A capybara, how do you spell it? Where it now refers to the orthographic pattern that is linked with the capybara and not the kind, and so on. And so is there a way to also make those kind of internal mappings less straightforward and look a little bit more inferential in your model?
I'm trying to think of, do you have an example of in mind where we use objects to depict, so we use objects to stand for discourse reference, where these mappings are as intricate as they are in natural language, because my focus hasn't been on.
Okay, so this isn't really something you're worrying about yet. Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Hi, this is super interesting. And I have what I think is maybe just a clarification question. One way to read the talk is that there's nothing special about stand for relations. That exactly the same thing that I do when I encounter a person, say Ellen, on the street, is I have that object in the world, I create an object file, I connect that to a discourse representation, and I then link that up to some conceptual information. Is that the right interpretation, that there's nothing extra for the stand for relation compared to reality?
Yes, yes, I think that's the case. I have focused on pretend play because there the dissociation is clear and very much visible.
Okay,
but that's
Thank
the
you.
direction.
Yep.
We have time for one more quick question, if there's a quick one.
Can I join in to the last question?
Please.
Because I disagree with both of them. So I think there is something special. So if Alan comes on the street, he doesn't stand for Alan, he's Alan, right? But here we talk about the stand for relation. So something which has a function to stand for something. Of course, in some context, a person can stand for himself if it is used in the sense. But just by itself, no one stands for itself in the same sense as it used by in this context.
No, that I understood, but I guess my question is there any mechanism that's special for the stand for relation, or is it just exactly the same mechanisms that we use when we encounter a person and we recognize them? Or is there like some additional thing that's not in the model, or that's in the model that's not in the normal case when you just encounter somebody?
You mean when we recognize somebody?
Yeah, I mean, when you encounter somebody, you have an object representation, you say, oh yeah, that's Ellen. So then you bring up your conceptual knowledge about that person, right? And then you create a discourse representation that has that information bound to it. So my question is, what's different about that process from I see a box and I connect that up to a discourse representation and I bind the information banana to it? It's like, what's different?
Okay, I see. I sorry, I didn't get the question. So first, I think this model is different from the object files, which just represent an object and then get a header conceptual description on them. There's no that information is about a particular object in the world. It's a single thing that I am representing here. There are two things. One of them is doing the depiction part. It's the symbol which is out there in the here and now, and which is used to talk about something else. And that something else is created top down from the conceptual system. Is an object that doesn't exist and will never exist. That's the banana and phone example that everybody uses. The phone that the banana stands for is
Okay, I have to cut it off at this point, but we can pick it back up in the discussion period if we want to. So now let's turn things over to our final speaker for the session. I'd like to introduce Ellen Lau from the University of Maryland.
Okay, good.
Yep, looks great.
Okay, I thank you. It's such an honor to be part of this wonderful workshop, and hopefully this talk will maybe provide some of the neural implementation directly from the last talk. Okay, so I do neuroscience, so I'll start with a long-standing puzzle from the neuroscience of language. And that is that when we do fMRI studies on sentence comprehension, we see areas like temporal cortex and Broca's area, inferior frontal cortex lighting up. And that probably shouldn't be that surprising to you because these are our classic language areas. However, across many studies in the literature, we also see this additional region lighting up over here in inferior parietal cortex. And the question is, why should that be? You know, what extra computation is this inferior parietal angular gyrus region doing beyond the linguistic analysis that we think these temporal and frontal regions are doing? And in standard introductions to neuroscience textbooks, one of the classic functions of inferior parietal cortex is supposed to be visual working memory. And so today I want to argue that this is one, perhaps a rare case where brain localization actually gives us some insight into the mind, and that it points us to something that we should have maybe been paying more attention to in our cognitive theories. And that is the non-linguistic conceptual working memory computations that are common to sentence comprehension and visual scene perception. Because of course, I can show you a picture, a scene of a boy with a cicada on his cheek, or a sentence, the boy has a cicada on his cheek. And while the input analysis is going to differ, either way, you can come back to me 5 minutes later and ask, well, what did he do with the cicada? Was he scared? Did it fly away from him? So the point is just to remember that whether it's vision in a non-communicative context or language in a communicative context, we of course access this common conceptual knowledge store to make new inferences and encode new episodic memories. Okay, so that's obvious, but we could have different views about this. Like one view you might have about this is that these streams meet at a pretty late point. That is that we do our language processing from speech analysis to syntactic and semantic analysis to discourse analysis over here. For vision, scene perception, we're doing early vision to object recognition to visual working memory over here. And where these streams meet is just in that they have common update to a common set of beliefs and knowledge and episodic long-term memory. And on this view of the world, maybe there's not too much to be gained for a language processing person to learn anything about vision and scene perception. And I think that's how many of us in sentence processing literature have often tended to proceed. But a different view you might have is that even prior to long-term episodic memory update, sentence comprehension and scene perception draw on common circuits for building and manipulating a working memory representation of entities and events, what we could call conceptual working memory or mental model or situation model, different terms used in the literature. And we might be drawn to an architecture like this one by the fact that we seem to integrate language and visual streams of information pretty seamlessly in real time. And that hippocampal amnesia patients who have lost this ability to encode long-term episodic memories can still understand scenes and conversations pretty normally. So today, I want to review some cognitive neuroscience arguments for one kind of circuit that I think belongs in this conceptual working memory common to scenes and sentences. And that is indexing from the last talk, right? So we have this beautiful neuroscience literature on visual scene perception that tells us that it's regions of inferior parietal cortex that support a limited capacity indexing system that binds visual and conceptual properties to temporary object files. Where's my brain? Down here, okay? And the hypothesis here is that in language comprehension, we make use of a similar non-linguistic capacity limited indexing system for tracking reference in this neighboring inferior parietal region. And when we look to prior language studies using EG, fMRI, and aphasia, we see that some of those effects bear the hallmarks of the object file system. So in this short talk, I'm just going to try to give you the flavor of that argument. Okay, so I'll go a little quickly because I know a lot of you know about object files already, but common perhaps intuition might be that we think visual objects are just defined by their properties. So I might think I've got some neurons that code color. So I've got some blue detectors. I've got some neurons coding shape. So I've got a square detector. And what it is to perceive a blue square is just to have those two detectors like co-firing. But what we know is that if you look at visual behavior, of course, it looks like viewers do more than that. They're creating these visual object pointers, these indexes that have a life of their own, independent of their properties, as in this classic case where we see a dot in the sky and across time, we might change the properties we're attributing to it. It's a bird, no, it's a plane, no, it's Superman. But what's constant across this is this object file representation, this index, which we can change the properties that are being bound. So we know there's a wonderful body of work from cognitive and developmental psychology that's identified the principles and hallmarks of this system from paradigms like multiple object tracking, Babu talked about. So the main things for today are just that these are pointers to collections of visual properties, but not determined by them. And it's also important for us that there's this capacity limitation on that system, that adults seem to be able to keep a maximum of 4 of those at a time. Now, what do they do for us? They accomplish a lot in vision. And today I just want to focus on these 2 functions that are important in both vision and language. That is individuation, which allows me to avoid duplicating entities to be encoded, to allow me to make appropriate episodic memory updates, right? I don't want to think because I was attributing bird properties and then I changed to attributing Superman properties that I saw a bird and I saw Superman. I want to, the individuation that's provided by object files will let me appropriately update those representations of entities. And how do we probe novel combinations? So as Ann Treisman pointed out, since maybe we can't, we don't think that we have neurons that code all kinds of combinations of features. So we don't think we come in with a purple giraffe neuron coding that allows me to recognize something as purple and giraffe and get to the one feature through the other. And these temporary instantaneous bindings are being provided by object files. Okay, So now moving to language, in language, we talk about this as reference, right? And so since one of the primary goals of sentence comprehension is updating my knowledge about the world, we know that this can't be done without an indexing system for binding information in new tokens and reference. So when I read "a woman saw a dancing peanut," what I need to do is not just activate the dance concept and the peanut concept and link those concepts. What I want to do is create this new token with peanut properties so I can carry forward in memory that that one particular peanut was dancing, not that peanuts in general dance. So just like in vision, I need to index these novel bindings so I can draw appropriate inferences. And so that when I hit pronouns or a new mention to the peanut, I make appropriate belief updates and don't encode an episodic memory that there were two different peanuts. And so dynamic semantics theories are one classic way of formalizing that idea, right? That, as Barbu mentioned, that sentences are instructions for updating a discourse representation, where we talk about sometimes in this literature of each new discourse referent that's introduced as getting its own file card. And we might talk about getting a discourse file for woman and a discourse file for dog. So now let's turn to the neuroscience to see to what extent these analogous indexing mechanisms for object files and for discourse files actually depend on common neural circuitry. So Yaoda Shu has several really nice reviews of this cognitive neuroscience literature showing that it's inferior parietal cortex that supports the temporary binding of properties that are coded by the ventral visual stream and temporal cortex down here, that it's inferior parietal cortex providing the binding. So let's look quickly at three kinds of evidence. So first is evidence from lesions. So when patients have rare bilateral damage to parietal cortex, they show severe binding problems. They're often only aware of one object at a time. They struggle to comprehend the overall meaning of a visual scene. And they make many more binding errors where they're like misbinding properties like the color of one object on the screen to the shape of another. In fMRI responses that measure neural metabolism, we see sort of a more precise neural metric, and that is that the inferior interparietal sulcus response is modulated as a function of the number of object files and being maintained, and crucially not the complexity of the features bound to them. So we can see that in this kind of manipulation where we contrast working memory for one thing versus 4 things with the same properties, 4 circles, and 4 things with different properties, different shapes. We see that other visual regions like down in temporal cortex care about the number of different properties I've got to encode, but inferior parietal cortex, interparietal sulcus in particular for vision, really cares about the number of indexes I've got to maintain, okay, not the properties. We can also see that when we directly cross both the number of indexes to maintain and the complexity of the features that are bound to each object. So these objects are more complex than these ones. We know that in behavior, we're strongly impacted by both. We take a hit for more objects, but also for more features. But the fMRI response in the interparietal sulcus allows us to isolate the indexing function itself. You can see here that activity in that region is modulated by the number of indexes up to that limit of 4, and not by the properties being bound to the complexity of the properties being bound to them. Finally, the third kind of evidence comes from EEG, which doesn't have good spatial localization, but tells us how responses evolve across time. And here there's a classic literature showing sustained negativity responses, negative always being plotted up in EEG, right? Where we see that this amplitude of this sustained response tracks, again, the number of items that I'm maintaining, the number of indexes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, okay? All right, so those are the neural hallmarks of the object file system in scene perception. And now we want to explore the hypothesis that in language comprehension, adjacent inferior parietal regions and angular gyrus support the same kind of indexing function, okay, binding conceptual properties to referential indexes. Where here we think that these conceptual properties are mainly these amodal ones here at the anterior end of temporal cortex, rather than like the visual specific properties back here in posterior temporal cortex. Okay, so now I'll give you a quick sense of the kind of neural data that might motivate this hypothesis. So the first hallmark we talked about of the visual object file system is that we see increased feature binding errors with damage to parietal cortex. Now, in language, we have a certain kind of classic binding error in aphasia patients, and that is mixing up the argument role bindings in sentence picture matching for cases like the girl was dried by the woman, that we mistakenly matched that to this picture. And these kinds of errors were associated with Broca's aphasia in the 70s and 80s, but this was at a time where we didn't have actual lesion locations for the patients that we were studying. And more recent work with a large set of patients with precise lesion data reports that those argument role misbindings are actually most associated with damage to left angular gyrus and inferior parietal cortex and not Broca's error. So that follows directly from this indexing hypothesis, where this region is critical for the accurate binding of the properties to the indexes. And it reminds us that success on sentence picture matching requires not just correct linguistic analysis. It requires us to accurately maintain the binding of, sorry, lost my slides. Accurately maintain the binding of the properties to the referential indexes. So it's both linguistic analysis, but also it's this non-linguistic referential working memory. Okay, hallmark number 2 of the visual object file system was this increased fMRI response in inferior parietal cortex that tracks the number of indexes that we're maintaining in working memory. And that brings us to the classic fMRI effect that we started the talk with, which is the fact that this inferior parietal region, the angular gyrus, responds more to sentences than scrambled sentences across many, many studies in the literature. And that follows from this account because only structured sentences, like 2 clients examine this nice couch, are giving us the instructions to index individuals. So obviously that's not going to happen in the scrambled sentences. Another thing we see in many fMRI studies in language literature is that in Jabberwocky sentences, structured nonsense, like I perceive that you should be gept the tropofol of your Lou Viruit, in contrast to some other frontal and temporal areas of language work that respond to increased activity kinds of Jabberwocky sentences, the angular gyrus does not. And that makes sense on this hypothesis because this region is not doing linguistic analysis per se. It's binding conceptual properties to indexes, and no conceptual properties are being provided by Jabberwocky. And in this 2019 fMRI experiment, we saw that the angular gyrus responded equally to lexically matched noun phrases and verb phrases like the frightened boy and frightened the boy. And both responded more than a scrambled baseline. And this is harder to capture on account where this region is coding something about linguistic structure, but it can be predicted by the referential indexing account because in both cases you can bind properties to indexes, whether you're indexing an entity or whether you're indexing an event. Okay, the last hallmark I told you about is this sustained negativity that increases in amplitude with the number of indexes to be encoded in working memory. And in the language literature, we have this classic ERP work that shows a sustained negativity in situations of referential ambiguity. So these are like you might have a little discourse like David asked the 2 girls to clean up their room, but one of the girls stayed in bed all morning. The other girl had been on the phone all the time. Then we get the sentence, David told the girl that. So we have this temporary ambiguity about girl 2, And from the onset of that ambiguous period, we see a sustained increased negativity for the ambiguous condition relative to a control where we only have one referent, or where reference is unambiguous. Now, one interpretation of this ERP effect might just be general ambiguity resolution cost. But the indexing hypothesis could give us a more specific account of what's happening in this case. And that is that you could be temporarily encoding a third index until the reference is disambiguated. So you have your index 1 coding this girl and her properties of staying in bed. You have index 2 coding girl property again, and this girl being on the phone. Now I can open this index 3 in this ambiguous situation to start binding those properties here to wait until I know which of these indexes I want to merge this one with. And consistent with that idea about this anterior negativity is the fact that we also see this response when a pronoun mismatches the antecedent, triggering the addition of a new referent to the model. So these are cases like the boy thought that he would win the race. So when I get to he, I can just maintain my one index that I'm binding more and more properties to. But when I get she, the boy thought that she would win the race. Now I have to posit a new referent in the model, right? And so it's exactly in this situation that now I see increased negativity, perhaps associated with encoding, binding more indexes. And consistent with that, an fMRI study that looked at both kinds of contrast, referential ambiguity and what they call referential failure. In both cases, we see increased inferior parietal responses in the fMRI. Okay, last one comes from what we would say the syntactic processing literature in EG. So here we have this classic literature showing sustainability across these long distance WH syntactic dependencies, comparing something like, what did the commentary from the spokesman interrupt? Where this what is being interpreted down here relative to a control like, did the commentary from the spokesman interrupt the game? And naturally, so we see this sustained negativity across the WH dependency. And naturally, many of us thought that this reflected syntactic working memory load, that is analysis of the linguistic signal itself. But we and others recently have found this effect is modulated by non-syntactic contextual factors. So we're now investigating the idea that this response has the same source as the sustained negativities for visual working memory, for referential processing. That is just maintaining an extra reference index introduced by that WH phrase. So to summarize, there's suggestive evidence that inferior parietal cortex plays this common computational role in referential indexing across scene and sentence comprehension. And I think this suggests that sentence people like me might learn more from studying visual working memory than verbal working memory because of this beautiful cognitive psychology and neuroscience literature we have on the object file system can give us these measures that we can use for referential processing in language. And I think finally, we see that some properties of sentence comprehension that we have in the past attributed to linguistic analysis may rather be reflections of this non-linguistic conceptual working memory that's shared with scenes. And I think that as sentence people, we shouldn't be disappointed by that. We can just take heart and now think that discourse isn't totally unsystematic, that the neuroscience of the object file system can give us hope that there are these understandable linking functions to neural measures that provide a great way to study this. And that will in turn give us a better handle on narrowing on the linguistic analysis computations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. We have some time for questions just about Ellen's talk before we go to the broader set of presentations. And we'll take the first question from Alexis.
Hey, hi, thanks. Ellen, that was awesome. Thank you. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about the language indexing system connections. Like if I'm a linguist and I want to think about which parts of the sentence are going to give me these indices and so on. And I think this is probably just a clarification, but especially I'm thinking when you're talking about like the similar NP-VP effects with like the frightened girl versus frightened boy, you indicated that both objects and events can be indexed, and that's why these were treated similarly. And I was wondering if that's right, and that's what you intended. You know, if so, is there a disanalogy there with visual indexing or not? Like, do we have evidence for visual indexing of events? And then it also kind of sounded inconsistent because later an expression like "girl stayed in bed," you know, the VP is indicated as giving us a property bound to the index standing for the girl, and then there's sort of questions like, well, how many indices are we going to have for like the girl ran the race?
Yeah, I am kind of agnostic and ignorant as someone new to this area about what the status is of events being indexed by object files. I think that those effects that we have for NPs and VPs can probably be accounted for either way, because either way there's an NP in the expression that could be indexed. But yeah, this is again beyond my, but we know, so there is some kind of event in AFRA that we can do, but it seems different than nominal in AFRA. So yeah, I've been trying to read the visual literature about object files and events to try to get a better handle on what we want to do here. I do think that, as somebody mentioned earlier, Craig's example of how we can flip from focusing on, say, like the conceptual thing to like the word itself. And I mean, I think you see it in the object file literature too, right? You can dynamically move what you're indexing. So maybe that will capture some of the fact that you can code the same sentence like in different ways, you know, but again, this is beyond my pay grade at the moment.
We also have another question from Balint.
Thank you for this great talk. It's a really exciting reinterpretation. I was wondering, don't worry if you don't have an answer, but I was wondering about angular gyrus activations which are not involving sentence processing and not involving visual stuff, but single words. I have a study, I have another foot in metaphor research where we produced not single words, but compound words, which were conventional metaphors as a specific example that activated this region. And I couldn't make much about it. Do you have any ideas how is this connected to the conceptual framework that you created?
Yeah, it's a trouble. Like, I mean, across most of the language literature that's seen angular gyrus activation, it's usually like stronger for combinatorial expressions. But there are these studies, a handful of studies that show response to single words. I can think of a couple possibilities. It could be that like the task demands lead you to do indexing in some single word tasks. Like you actually take a strategy of trying to set up a referent. That's one possibility. Another thing that's, as you may know, is a big problem for everybody working with the angular gyrus is, but I mean, it makes sense, is the fact that this region is involved in the default mode network. So that is sort of mentalizing, just mind wandering, just thought that it comes on when you're just lying there in the scanner. And so the trouble with that is it's really hard to set a baseline. So if you give people like a very boring control task, or if your two conditions aren't shared and how quickly they can be done, you could get more mind wandering in one condition than the other, and that could drive, right? So I think some of the studies, single word studies in the literature might have had that property, but yeah, it's a very good question.
It did have that property. That condition activated the default mode network as well. So thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So now at this point, we've spilled over into the general question period. So I see that we have a question from Craig, but first I wanted to give Marina a chance to pick back up the discussion from before if you wanted to.
That's okay. We can keep going and yeah.
I also wanted to give priority to Jeff if you wanted to pick your question back up again.
I'm good.
Okay, let's go to Craig then.
Okay, this might be quick, and I guess this could actually be directed to multiple individuals. So, Ellen, did you mention Abraham et al. 2008 in your survey of studies? So this is, I think it was in JCN. So they I think the story is that you get stronger anterior prefrontal cortex activation when you have stories with real people as opposed to fictional people, which would again, I think, have some kind of because you're doing kind of real world indexing in the former case and making stuff up more in the latter case. And so I think there will be some connection there.
Yeah, I had never thought until Barbu's talk about, like I said, I'm somewhat new to this area in the last couple of years, and I had never thought about there being an important distinction between the real world indexing and the discourse indexing, although I do think there's some evidence for these slightly different inferior parietal regions that might map onto this object file to discourse file mapping that you had there. But I hadn't thought that they would be different. So that's interesting. I just have to think about it.
Yeah, okay. I'll just put that on your radar. And just sort of another sort of behavioral thing that's been sort of kicking, in the back rooms of people who've done work on pronouns in particular, and also I think on relative clause processing, is that if you have famous people as the characters in your stories, often you get much sharper effects relative to, John and Michael went to the store kind of stuff. And so I think that also sort of has some broader connections to some of the themes that have been brought up today in attentional indexing.
Yeah, to me, it really helps me understand a lot of these puzzling little, like you say, lore and the sentence processing literature. Like if you use just definite NPs and stuff, then people are getting them more confused, or the relative clauses are harder. And it's always been hard to understand why, if we thought these were syntactic complexity effects, why would those kinds of things matter? But if we think that part of the problem is keeping those bindings in conceptual working memory, then makes total sense. Yeah.
Do any of our other speakers have something to say on this point? Okay, if not, then we have a question for Marina, but I also wanted to signal, Craig, there's a question in the chat about sharing the reference you mentioned, if you could follow up on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Ellen, this question is mostly for you. I love this way that you're thinking about these problems. I think it's a very deep puzzle. One thing I was wondering about is kind of trying to understand, it's interesting that it's kind of related to the previous question, which is, it's interesting that the example you chose is like some of these kind of very pared down working memory experiments as a reference point, as opposed to like, say you're watching a movie, right? People are talking, stuff is happening, and clearly you're integrating all of that information into a mental model, right? So we have to have some sort of mental model, which is commonly shared among these different sources of information. And so I guess one question that I have is, which are you thinking about, the indexer or the index? So do you think that this is the mental model itself? So of course, when you posit a new entity and you have to keep track of it, the mental model becomes more complex, it's enriched. The way there's sometimes when you were talking about it, is it sound like you think of it as like some indexing mechanism, like separate from the mental model itself, or are you thinking of it as like the mental model representation of the situation? So yeah.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I guess I'm trying to be a little bit conservative because I feel very confused. I'm trying to keep it simple. So the indexing, where we're binding some set of complex properties to indexes, that I think we can all kind of latch onto. We have the object file literature to help us think about that. Now, the situation model, there's definitely literature, people that have worked on the mental models and the situation models, but I guess the big problem for everybody is how are we going to encode those relations and compute those relations across the indexes? Now, I kind of think that it's probably happening in regions of inferior parietal cortex just for working memory manipulation. Like, I think that would be the logical operands for those mental model, situation model computations. That would make sense to me. But I can't yet. I'd rather pursue first the idea that at least the neural activity in these measures is simply tracking the maintenance of the indexes themselves and see how much that can cover before we ask whether there's also like, I feel like what you're suggesting is sort of like the combinatorial operations, or sort of like the underlying structure of the mental model itself. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have something useful to say about that? Who knows more?
I mean, it's complicated. It comes up in other domains as well, right? In the visual working memory domain, people have been puzzling over like, oh, is there a separate working memory and a separate long-term, you know, and a separate, so, and it seems like at least one trend is to say like, actually, no. So it's all one thing. So it's, you know, there's a question about whether we want to posit like chunks of brain for just the indexing part rather than like like a conceptual representation that also has to, you know, which will be sensitive to this important thing that you're like, you're kind of saying
Yeah.
multiple things, right? One is sentence comprehension and conceptual representations have to share something because we have mental models, right? Otherwise, why would we
Right.
bother talking? That's really important. And what's the neural basis of that? That seems, and then the other question is like, what is the indexing mechanism when we posit entities within those mental model representations? And I wonder whether they're one and the same in the end.
Right. I guess, yeah, it's good, really useful the way you put it. So I guess like, I would doubt that all of this whole region is just devoted to indexing or something. But it might be that like the neural activity that like fMRI and EEG are able, you know, like we might not be able to see the relations that we've added or something in for your parietal cortex, but maybe this maintenance process, since it's energy demanding, it might just be lucky that the indexes are what we can see. So I think that's a really good distinction to make. The other thing, just to pick up on, you mentioned about watching videos at the beginning, and I agree. And if anyone wants to contact me or post on the thing, like I have felt just so like, I don't know where the literature is on working memory for something beyond like colored dots or, you know, the small object file literature. And it's like, we must feels like this gap in the cogneural literature is just to talk about where is this common conceptual working memory mental model thing, what during videos, during scenes. And I'm having trouble finding that literature.
We have another question from Ballant.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to ask you, Ellen, about the model a bit more, where you showed this conception of conceptual working memory as mental models, and it's linked to beliefs that you labeled as long-term, and then in the other direction, in the language branch, there's the semantic syntactic box. And I was wondering, so I had the idea that the semantic memory is also long-term. So how the long-term and the episodic, the semantic is separated, or are they separated? How?
Yeah, so I think that's just a terminological problem. I probably shouldn't have even put on the slide, but I was using semantic in the linguist sense of like some level of linguistic representation that's not syntax itself, but it's you know, closer to a semantic representation, but where it's still language specific. So that's all I meant. Yeah, I try not to use the word semantic memory because it's so confusing, the linguists and the cognitive scientists that I talk to. But yeah, all of those representations have to like point, you know, like the semantic representation has to be able to point to the conceptual categories, and then the working memory representation has to point to the conceptual categories, and then the episodic memory has to point to the conceptual categories. So they're all going to have to, you know, have conceptual properties as their pieces.
Okay, so it just happened that the long-term kind of beliefs is just not on your figure, is not divided into conceptual and episodic.
Oh, okay. So episodic memory. So Right. So it's important that, okay, first the hippocampus is like coding the episodic memories, right? And then, and I call that sort of long term because that lasts for, minutes to months. So that's in the parietal cortex and the, lateral cortex, it seems like we can't immediately form these synaptic connections. So we have to have this sustained firing to hold the bindings, right? But then the hippocampus and medial temporal lobe seems like wonderfully able to immediately form those synaptic bindings online. And then, right, over time, like over the next month, you're encoding those as real long-term conceptual memory, like on the outside, right? So, so there is some distinction there, but I think for us and what we're kind of interested in, we could be thinking in the language processing or scene perception trajectory, all we have to worry about is getting to the hippocampus. Of course, for conceptual learning, like really long term, then we have that last process that gives us conceptual knowledge. Okay, sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're winding down a bit here, but we have time for one or two more questions if anyone has one.
Could I ask Barbu to give thoughts about how our two talks connected to each other? Because I'm curious.
Please.
Very much so, but I need to. We should talk about this.
That's the beauty of the Slack. We can continue these conversations, for the rest of the week, basically. Okay, if there's no other questions, maybe we'll cap it off for the day. Thank you for spending your morning, afternoon, or evening with us. And we'll see you back here tomorrow for the start.